Well, we're pleased to welcome to the Communicators for the first time one of the newest FCC commissioners, Ajit Pai, one of the two Republicans on the commission. Mr. Commissioner, thanks for being with us here on the Communicators.
Thank you very much for having me.
In July, you spoke at Carnegie Mellon, and you talked a little bit about the regulatory process, the slowness of the process, and the FCC's the way the FCC does business. I want to get your further thoughts on that and also get you to reflect on your first few months on the Federal Communications Commission.
Well, thank you for the question, and thanks again for having me. It's a privilege to be on the show. At Carnegie Mellon, one of the things I tried to identify was ways that the FCC could establish a regulatory framework that would allow the ICT, or Information and Communications Technology sector, to really be a leader in job creation and economic growth. It historically has been one of the most dynamic parts of the economy. But in recent years, if you look at the statistics from the Labor Department, job growth and economic growth has slowed. I identified three basic areas where I thought the FCC could do more in those with respect to the ICT sector. Number one was more internal. The FCC should act at the same pace as the industry that it regulates. One of the things I've heard from a number of companies and individuals that I've met with is that the FCC has sometimes not acted with much alacrity with respect to issues that are pending before the Commission, or in delaying action on other issues. And so I wanted to think about different ways that the Commission could speed up its processes. Second, I think that one of the key things that the Commission can do and should do to enable a more dynamic industry is to get more spectrum into the commercial marketplace. There have been a number of different proposals on the table, and I take an all of the above approach with respect to spectrum policy. And finally, I tried to think of different ways that the FCC could remove barriers to infrastructure investment. Some studies have estimated that for every $1 billion that the private sector spends on fiber deployment, for example, between 15,000 and 20,000 new jobs could be created. So from a regulatory perspective, my view is that our goal should be to remove the barriers to enable the private sector to take those risks and to make those multi-billion-dollar investment decisions.
Well, what is one of those barriers that you think could be removed or mitigated?
I think the primary one is more conceptual in nature, but it applies in a whole bunch of different areas, and that is this. Our telephone regulations were developed largely in an era where you had voice communications traveling over copper wires, and those wires were operated by monopolies. And so those regulations were basically enacted at a time when you had a very different landscape than you have today. Today, there is a lot of different competition, intermodal competition, where you have cable companies and wireless companies competing with the telephone companies to provide the same service. And so, in my view, the FCC should take a forward-thinking approach, look at a more technologically neutral, less regulatory way of thinking about some of these services. So when it comes to fiber deployment, for example, my view is that we should not think of it in the same ways we thought about copper wire monopolies back in the 1970s. We should think about competitive fiber providers across different industries.
Do you think your fellow four commissioners agree with your thought process?
I think it really depends on the particular issue. There have been some issues where we've agreed and some where we've disagreed. I was heartened, this doesn't necessarily relate to the FCC directly, my colleagues at the Commission, but recently Governor Brown in California signed a bill making sure that IP, or Internet Protocol-based services, would remain free from regulation. And he focused on VoIP, voice over IP in particular. That was a bipartisan group of Republicans and Democrats coming together to say, we want to have innovation and we want to incentivize investment in next generation networks. And the way to do that is to make sure that we don't apply those legacy regulations to those networks.
Well, joining our conversation is one of our regular guest reporters, Eliza Krigman of Politico.
Thanks so much for having me. Happy to be here. Let's talk a little bit more about telecommunication infrastructure that you were just mentioning. Do you think that the telecommunication companies in a few years are going to be competitive with cable in wireline access? And if so, how are they going to do that without upgrading their networks?
I think they will be competitive. I think you've seen an increased amount of competition in recent years, and in last year alone, communications companies spent $66 billion in infrastructure investment. That's a very substantial amount, and especially in the current economic climate. I have to believe they wouldn't make such substantial investments if they didn't anticipate really making a splash in the competitive marketplace.
So you're confident they will make the investments necessary to remain a direct competitor with cable?
They will, with one caveat. They want to know that the rules of the road are going to be certain and predictable. And so to the extent that we at the FCC can do everything we can to make sure that our regulatory framework gives them the incentives to take those risks, then I think the answer to your question is yes.
Okay. One of the hottest topics in telecommunications right now is spectrum and the incentive auctions, and the FCC just moved forward last week with that process. Should one entity or one company be able to purchase all of the spectrum that's made available through this auction?
Well, in my view, we have to ensure robust participation, and that applies not just to the participants in the reverse auction, the television broadcasters, but also participation on the forward auction, which is the wireless broadband providers. I certainly am not of the view that the FCC should artificially limit who can participate. We certainly want to make sure that as many wireless providers as possible participate in the forward auction, and so my view is that as long as we make clear rules of the road and don't artificially limit the spectrum holdings or other types of regulatory barriers, we will see robust participation.
So define artificially limit. Does that mean then that one company can purchase it all if they simply make the highest bid and there is robust participation?
Well, our goal, of course, should be to ensure that the spectrum that is reclaimed or relinquished by the television broadcasters is put to the highest valued use. And so the question is, well, what is the highest valued use? In the current environment with competitive bidding, of course, the highest valued use is typically measured by who is the highest bidder at the auction. But one of the artificial limits that I was mentioning was setting a limit in particular markets, and especially where certain providers can't hold more than X amount. And if that amount that we limit, where we set the limit, is not based on particular facts identifying competitive realities in the marketplace, that view could unintendedly limit how robust this spectrum auction could be.
Now, Commissioner Pai, one of the concerns from the broadcasters is, first of all, they don't have extra spectrum, is one of their thoughts, and also the spectrum that they gave up earlier has not been put into use. Are those fair concerns?
Well, I think it is important for us to take into account those concerns. And one of the 4 principles that I outlined in my statement when we approved the order last Friday is that whatever action the Commission takes, it has to be fair to all stakeholders. And one of the principal stakeholders in this context are the television broadcasters. And so we need to take into account their concerns, not just with respect to the spectrum that they recently relinquished, but with their concerns about the entire process. How would the repacking process work, for example? How should they think about valuation of the spectrum that they hold? What should be the framework, or what guidelines should they think about when it comes to channel sharing? Those are a number of the concerns that we should listen to as we think about setting up the rules for the auction. What
about looking at government-held spectrum as well?
That's another piece of the puzzle that I've talked about repeatedly since I got to the FCC. It's a critical part to the extent that the federal government, by some estimates, controls approximately 40% of the entire usable electromagnetic spectrum. And I think we need to think creatively about ways to facilitate the clearing and reallocation of federal spectrum in cases where it's not being used or not being used as efficiently. And to the extent that's not possible, I'm not opposed to innovative sharing strategies.
Do you think that there's a better solution? Is there a better solution than the spectrum auctions to get spectrum out in the marketplace?
Well, as I outlined in Pittsburgh, I take an all-of-the-above approach. And so while the television broadcast spectrum is one critical part of the puzzle that could work to the benefit of consumers, it's not the only one. There are other bands that I've talked about where the Commission could take action. As you know, the National Broadband Plan 2 years ago set ambitious thresholds for action by the Commission in terms of spectrum, freeing up 300 megahertz of spectrum by 2015 and 500 megahertz by 2020. Some of the 300 megahertz that it identified for reallocation by 2015 are still on the table. The AWS-4 spectrum, for example, the WCS spectrum that we're going to be voting on later this month. And so, consistent with my all-of-the-above approach, I'm excited that the Commission will have an opportunity to take a look at all possible solutions to this problem.
Well, and one of the other issues regarding spectrum is that Light Squared is made a new proposal. What do you think about Light Squared and its chances of getting that proposal approved?
I have seen, obviously trade reports about the Light Squared proposal. I have not had the opportunity to read the particular filings that it's made and any comments on those filings, but I certainly look forward to digging into the record and making the appropriate judgment.
Eliza Krigman.
On Light Squared still, though, give us a sense about the feeling at the Commission about Light Squared. It's been a political saga that's taken up much of the bandwidth, the discussion about spectrum over the past year and a half. Are you optimistic that there can be a path forward for them, or is this just sort of a last-ditch attempt to keep their debtors away?
Unfortunately, I'm hesitate to opine to the extent that I haven't had an opportunity to look at the filings, as I mentioned, or to talk to my colleagues. So some of my colleagues who were here for some time during Light Squared's previous proceedings, we just haven't had a chance to discuss it. So I can't really forecast where that proceeding will end up.
Fair enough. On another spectrum issue, right now there's a lot of tension between the administration and industry over to what extent spectrum exhaust can be addressed by sharing. Is the PCAST report wishful thinking, or is it wishful thinking for industry to think that they're going to get clear swaths at this point in time?
Well, I am certainly not opposed to innovative strategies that would facilitate sharing. To the extent that certain federal users are unable or unwilling to relinquish the spectrum and get it cleared, then if sharing is all that we have left and there's a definable strategy for doing it that's technologically feasible and it can be done within a certain time frame, I'm in favor of it. But in my view, our principal goal should be to clear and reallocate the spectrum. And the reason is that from a commercial standpoint, you're able to make much more advanced plans about how to use that spectrum on the commercial side if you have an unencumbered property right to it. If there's a federal user that could preempt you in certain situations or within certain geographic areas, then the value of that spectrum goes down because you're not quite sure how to deploy it in the most efficient way possible. So clearing, in my view, should be the focus. So
does the FCC have some work cut out for itself in convincing the administration that they need to put more emphasis on the clearing strategy?
Well, I've certainly made that statement, and I've worked with some of my colleagues at the Commission and outside of the Commission to make sure that that happens. So I'm optimistic that we can reach a consensus on that.
Commissioner Pai, there's another issue that the FCC is looking at this week, and that's the exclusivity ban, or at least it's scheduled to be. Last week on the Communicators, David Cohen of Comcast was our guest. Here's what he had to say about the exclusivity ban.
I think the chairman's order, as you describe it, is the appropriate course of action to take. And that's been Comcast's position in the proceeding. Life is long. As you note, our order lasts until 2018. And so for whatever it applies to over that period of time, it applies to. But after that period of time, we should be treated like everybody else. And again, if people believe that it is appropriate for the exclusivity ban to continue, they need to go back to Congress and to get different legislation than the legislation that exists now, because the current legislation simply does not support the exclusivity ban in the current competitive posture of the marketplace.
So what happens when October 5th rolls around and it expires, presumably? I mean, do we suddenly see several exclusive contracts out there?
So I don't think so. I think the fears there have been overstated, but I obviously don't know for sure.
What's your reaction to what Mr. Cohen had to say and to the exclusivity ban?
Well, I guess starting from a very general premise, my view is that our regulations should take into account the current state of the marketplace. Congress, when it enacted this provision, instructed the Commission to continue it based upon an assessment of where things stood in the market at that point. We are now at that point because the exclusivity ban is scheduled to expire on Friday. And so one of the things the Commission has been wrestling with is, does this prohibition continue to be necessary in the interest of competition? One of the things I've been working with my colleagues on, and we've been having many meetings with people on the outside on, is how do we think about competition in this marketplace? Does the ban continue to be necessary? And so we've heard from a variety of people who advance a variety of perspectives on that question. My own view is that the rules should generally, and with respect to this particular instance, have to keep track of and have to be consistent with the current realities in the marketplace.
And the current realities are that it should expire.
That is certainly what has been proposed, and without giving too much of a forecast of where things are going to end up, I think there is a general consensus based upon, in part, the D.C. Circuit's recent decision a few years ago that competition in this area has changed compared to where it was in 1992.
Representative Markey recently sent a letter to the FCC asking that it be retained because he says it will stifle competition, lead to higher prices.
Yes, there are certainly debates on worthwhile perspectives on both sides of this question. He has, as one of the people who helped author this provision, he has advanced that perspective. On the other side of the ledger, folks have argued that if you let the ban expire, then that increases the incentive for competitors to make their own investments in certain kinds of programming, and so you could actually boost competition by maintaining the ban. There's also been the argument that the ban could help promote more competition by making distributors, giving them a heightened incentive to distribute the programming.
Prior to joining or being appointed to the Federal Communications Commission, Ajit Pai served as deputy counsel at the FCC. He also worked at Verizon. He is a graduate of Harvard and law degree from the University of Chicago. Eliza Krigman of Politico. Next question.
Yes, a very impressive background for this position. Since you have worked at Verizon Communications, I am curious, have you been lobbied by any of the people that you used to work with?
I have not, no.
Okay, on that same topic, I'd like to ask, the FCC is supposed to operate in the public interest, but the reality of the matter is that most of the people who comment on the public record are the well-heeled lobbyists, and that's who the Commission also spends a lot of time meeting with. What are you going to do personally to ensure that your opinion is informed by what's happening with the average consumer and not just the Washington operators?
Well, at my confirmation hearing in November of last year, I stated that I would hold no favor for or prejudice against any particular company, person, or segment of the industry. And I would like to think that in the 4.5 months that I've had the privilege of serving at the FCC, that I've stayed true to that. I've taken literally hundreds of meetings. Some of them have been with representatives of different companies whom we regulate, but a number have been with public interest groups, even individuals. And when I go outside of Washington to visit various places, I make a point of visiting citizens who are not involved in the communications industry, but are directly affected by the decisions that we make. And one of those trips I took recently was to my hometown of Parsons, Kansas, where I heard from citizens, my fellow Parsonians, about different communications issues that affected them. And so I think that's a good way to stay grounded, as it were. Because I think it's often too easy to think about these things as abstractions on a page, as opposed to real issues that affect real people.
I'm glad you mentioned Kansas, actually. In a statement after you visited there, you wrote that too many providers who try to obtain such access are confronted with daunting sets of federal, state, municipal regulations with respect to the Google Fiber project there. Aside from municipalities that are banned from creating such networks, can you name some examples of providers who've tried to do the same and haven't been able to because of that?
One example is AT&T. They tried to introduce UVerse in the city of San Francisco, and it took several years for them to get the necessary regulatory approvals for them to roll out this video service. And I mention that in particular because video is one area where there has been a lot of talk about the need for increased competition. Well, here you have a traditional telecommunications provider trying to enter the marketplace to provide video. And in my view, municipalities and state governments and the federal government should do everything it can to reduce those barriers to make sure that we don't stand in the way of more competition.
David Cohen, on his episode of The Communicators, said that he wasn't concerned about Google Fiber being a competitive threat because he doesn't think that Google or anybody else simply has the money to be able to invest in it across the country. Do you think that's a problem we're facing, that there isn't enough capital to make that investment?
From my vantage point, I can't say whether or not there's enough capital. What I can say is that many companies have told me that they are sitting on billions of dollars on their balance sheets, in part because of regulatory uncertainty. And so, to the extent the rules of the road are not clear, they are going to be more hesitant to make those significant investments in fiber deployment or internet infrastructure, because it's not worth taking the risk if the rules might change after that decision is made.
It's been a priority of Chairman Janikowski's to clear some of the red tape you're talking about. Is there something that he's not doing right, and what should change in order to make this happen?
Well, I think there are several things that the Commission could do. The first one and foremost, I would argue, is what I mentioned earlier, making sure that we don't expand or extend the legacy regulations that were developed in the copper wire telephone monopoly era to next generation networks. That's a very simple concept that has broad application across a number of different areas. One of them, for example, is the Title II docket, which remains open to this day. Now, to the extent that we wanted to send a signal to the private sector that we were not going to take a heavy-handed regulatory approach to infrastructure investment, we could close that docket and let the private sector know that reclassification of internet services and other services as telecom services under Title II would be off the table. But we haven't done that. It's a very simple, symbolic step, but it could go a long way, I think, to sending the right message.
Ajit Pai, one of the issues you worked on at Verizon and at the FCC was broadband policy. Mm-hmm. In your view, has the National Broadband Plan been a successful one?
I think that the broadband plan identified a number of worthwhile goals. Spectrum is one example, as we discussed earlier. I think the key is for the FCC to be more expeditious in taking the necessary steps to meeting those goals. And so when it comes to spectrum, for instance, we should aggressively target each of the areas that were identified in the National Broadband Plan, and then we should do everything we can, as quickly as we can, to make sure that the Commission takes action. And so I'm hopeful that, working with the chairman and my fellow commissioners, we can make that a reality sooner rather than later.
Would you be supportive if that wanted to be built out further, or if more money were expended toward that?
Toward
furthering the broadband plan, if there was such a proposal?
Well, it depends on the specifics of the proposal, but in general, I stand with my colleagues in wanting to make sure that we have broadband deployment across the country.
And you've mentioned a couple times that you don't want to see regulation in the copper wire era today. There's been talk from time to time about revisiting some of the major telecommunications acts. Are we to a point in your view that telephony and cable and broadband and mobile are all such separate issues anymore that they can't be lumped into one telecommunications act, or would you like to see Congress move forward on updating some of the telecommunications laws?
One thing that I think everybody agrees on in this field, regardless of what particular position one might take, is that convergence is a reality. As you suggested in your question, we now have cable companies providing telephone service. We have telephone companies providing video service. We have wireless companies competing with each of them. We have satellite companies now providing broadband and other advanced services. And in that context, where convergence is a reality, not just an abstraction, it becomes difficult for the FCC, which is charged with administering the Communications Act, to apply some of the principles of that act to an industry where you have convergence. So does it make sense to have telecommunications services regulated under Title II? Does it make sense to have wireless services under Title III? Does it make sense to have cable services regulated under Title VI? In circumstances where regulatees are competing with each other to provide the same services. That is a very difficult question, and I wish there were something we could do from the FCC's perspective to make that transition an easier one. But the question lies in the first instance within the discretion of Congress, and so should Congress see fit to revisit the Act, I stand to be a willing partner in that effort.
Republicans talk a lot about what the FCC shouldn't do. Aside from repealing regulations, where should the FCC take action?
In terms of substantive areas or procedurally or?
Substantive areas and also procedurally.
Well, let me tackle the first one first because it is an apolitical position that I've taken on this, which is that the agency should act with more dispatch. I've advanced a number of different proposals that would allow the agency to respond more quickly to people on the outside who've asked for our guidance. A very simple one is setting deadlines. We often don't have any deadlines for acting on petitions for reconsideration or applications for review, for example. These are sort of arcane phrases, but essentially this requires the full commission to reconsider an earlier decision, either made by ourselves or by one of our subordinate bureaus. Quite often, applications for review will sit at the commission for years in some cases without any decision. In fact, very recently at a House hearing, we were asked about one application for review that had been pending, I believe, since 1999. And so by setting a deadline for action, the commission could ensure that we would make some decision within a certain time frame. And that does not just a good service to the parties to that proceeding, but it does a good service to the public because the public will know that the commission is responding reasonably. It's not just sitting on an issue. From a substantive standpoint, too, I think there are a lot of things we could do. I've talked about spectrum, I've talked about infrastructure investment. Media ownership is another one where we could update our rules to better account for changes in the marketplace that have taken place in some cases since 1975 when our rules were adopted.
Specifically, you've proposed an Office of Entrepreneurial Innovation to speed up the FCC approving or denying technology. Has that gotten any traction inside the agency with lawmakers, and would you need legislation to make that happen, or could the agency just do it?
The agency could implement that proposal. It's an internal organizational proposal, so we could do it if we wished. I've gotten favorable feedback from a number of different people. I haven't spoken with all of my colleagues about it, but I think in general they share my view that we should do everything we can to promote entrepreneurship and innovation. And to the extent that this office could shine a spotlight on that, and especially enforce Section 7 of the Communications Act, which is what I often like to think of as one of the forgotten sections. It basically tells the Commission to act on a proposal for a new technology or service within 1 year of its proposal. That is something I think we could do that would really send a strong message to the private sector that we want to work with you to make sure that you are able to provide the most cutting-edge services to the American public.
Do you think the FCC needs more personnel to enact these changes or create this office?
For this office, no. We have an existing office that I believe could be repurposed along with expert staff from our wireless bureau, from our engineering office. And so I don't think we would need any additional personnel or money to do it.
Ajit Pai, as we tape this today, it was announced that there's a potential merger between Deutsche Telekom and Metro PCS. Mm-hmm. What are your general thoughts? I'm sure you won't comment exactly on that merger, but what are your general thoughts on such a merger, and how would you have voted on the Deutsche AT&T merger?
So on the second question, I'm hesitant to express an opinion not having had the benefit of reading the filings, meeting with the interested parties. As you know, I was a nominee during the pendency of some of that, so I didn't have a chance from a commissioner's standpoint to really dig into those issues. With respect to the proposed merger that has been announced today, that's something that I think we should look at very carefully. I've advanced in the past my view that the Commission should review and resolve its look at those transactions within 180 days, if not sooner. And it's my hope that we will do that with respect to this particular transaction.
What would hold up 180 days? What would make it go longer?
Well, in some cases in the past, the Department of Justice and or the Federal Communications Commission has expressed concerns about the competitive implications of a particular transaction, and so I suppose that's something that could happen in the context of any transaction. But my hope is that 6 months should be more than enough to review any of these transactions.
According to your Twitter feed, and you're a relatively prolific tweeter, you met with Metro PCS on September 19th. Did they talk to you about their plans for this merger?
They did not.
Really?
No, I promise you, they didn't. It was an interesting chance, though, to take to hear from them about how they got off the ground, and it's one of those success stories where an innovator had an idea and started it with two of his friends, literally in a room about this size, and they've grown into one of the nation's biggest wireless companies.
Speaking of your Twitter feed, you've also been out in Silicon Valley and been meeting with different companies out there. Recent article in the Wall Street Journal about funding is down for startup tech companies, and Facebook stock is down, et cetera, Zynga, Groupon. What does that portend?
Well, I hope it doesn't portend that innovation and investment in this industry is slowing down. That is the lifeblood of this industry. And I know that there are a lot of interesting initiatives on Capitol Hill that have been proposed to make sure that that doesn't happen. I know that Senator Moran and Senator Warner, for example, have introduced the Startup Act 2.0 that would take a number of different measures to incentivize greater investment for startups in particular. And to the extent that there's something the FCC can do to make sure that there continues to be a vibrant venture capital and industry, that I'm happy to support that.
Do you think Washington pays enough attention to Silicon Valley?
I think it is quite often the case that Washington and Silicon Valley don't really think of each other all that much. When I was in Silicon Valley, a lot of people expressed concerns about spectrum, for example, but they didn't really think the FCC was interested in doing much about it or could do much about it. Conversely, here in Washington, I often hear that people in Silicon Valley don't understand the legacy frameworks of the Communications Act that we have to operate under, and so you sort of have two different conversations going past each other, even though we all share the same goal of maintaining a dynamic communications industry. So part of the reason that I went to California is to understand what drives innovation and investment in this industry, but also to hear from them about ways that Washington could be more engaged to make sure that our decisions both reflect the nature of the business and help them do what they do even better.
Final question, Eliza Craigman.
Let's talk about the politics at the FCC. Do you feel any pressure to be more conservative than Commissioner McDowell, and do you consult with one another about a team approach on the issues?
I don't feel any pressure one way or the other. I can tell you we've never had any conversation like that, and nor have I had a similar conversation about small p politics with any of my colleagues. It's remarkable how well we have worked together. The vast majority of our work is done on a bipartisan consensus basis. And when we do have concerns, these are issues where reasonable people can disagree, and we approach the disagreement in that way. And so I've been very fortunate to have four colleagues who are blessed with both a deep understanding of communications issues and with a collegial manner, because that makes my work at the Commission that much easier.
Ajit Pai is the newest Republican Commissioner on the Federal Communications Commission. Eliza Craigman is with Politico. Thank you both for being on the Communicators.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks so much.